Our next presenter is Professor Gabu Heindl from Vienna, Austria. She's joining us via Skype this morning, all the way from Vienna, and it's very late there, so we want to extend our special thanks to her.
Thank you.
Professor Heindl is an architect and an urban planner and head of the Gabu Heindl Architektur in Vienna, an interdisciplinary studio specialized in public interventions, culture or social buildings, urban research, and urban planning. Professor Heindl's work has been exhibited in Germany, China, the United States, among others. Based on her belief in the importance of public discourse about architecture and urbanism, Professor Heindl has been curating several exhibitions, lectures, and symposia on different aspects of politics, of the politics of planning and authoring and editing multiple publications. She has been teaching at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, University of Technology, Graz, and the University of Technological Delft, and lecturing as an invited guest or critic at many others. She will be presenting Subsidized Rentals, the Vienna Model. Bitte willkommen, Professor Gabu Heindl.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at your conference. I hope that my voice is it's good to hear. And I will introduce the subsidized rental system of Vienna. And I'm very happy to do that because, in fact, outside of Vienna, I find it very important to support this system, while inside of Vienna, it's important to constantly critique it in order to actually get it even better. If you need anything from me, I can see you now, but you just have to tell me if I should do or if I should change anything. I'm a practicing architect, and I don't want to get into any of my buildings or of my projects, but I do want to show you that my critique does come from a point of view as a practicing architect in Vienna. However, it also relates, as you can see, this is Vienna. From top, we're seeing the Donau Canal running right through the center. You see that Vienna is a very, very dense city. And in fact, Vienna has been labeled the most livable city of the world for, I believe, the 6th or 7th or even 8th time in a row. So, but I would also not want to miss the global condition that Vienna is in just as much as any other city, quite maybe not directly comparable, but in fact, similarly, a part of the global urbanization process. Vienna is a growing city. And of course, there is speculation on urban, of course. I'm sorry to say that. I don't think that it should be, but unfortunately, there is also in Vienna speculation on urban housing and on urban land. We are observing a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich worldwide, but also in Vienna. And not only me, but what has been called a collectivization of losses and privatization of gains. Well, however, Vienna is #1 livable city in the world, and I also looked it up for Honolulu. And in these Mercer studies, which of course do not feature everything, Honolulu seems to be the 23rd most livable city in the world, while Baghdad, for instance, is only number 231. However, livable city does not, as you know very well, mean or the same as affordable city. And then we even have to differentiate between, or let's say differentiate and ask affordable for whom. Now, looking at the 10 most unaffordable cities for housing, I found Honolulu. It's a Guardian article quite recently, and it says that Honolulu is the 7th least affordable city in the world, or in the list of cities being studied. And I cannot tell you the reasons why, and I don't know your city, unfortunately, and I'm hoping to I do hope to visit it at some point, but I guess that is why you do have this conference. And I've been invited to talk about Vienna because Vienna is in some rankings, and as I'm not a strong believer in rankings, but I've looked it up with some concepts. Vienna could be the seventh most affordable city of 30 being studied and so on. But let me tell you from kind of experience and from studies, Vienna is fairly affordable, and that relates to or is parts has been, so to say, a result of the Viennese social housing program, which I'm going to introduce to you now. In Vienna, you can, at average price, rent a housing unit for about 750 euros per square meters gross rent. And that could be either in a council housing block, a historic one, maybe from Red Vienna, or it can also be in a very new one, subsidized housing rental that has just been built and even won state prizes. And I'm sorry, you have to translate the euro and the square meters. I didn't do that for you to your prices. But that is very affordable. And why is that so? I will get into that later. Vienna is also a city, and I think it's maybe the only city in the world at this moment that has built an entirely subway line of like 10 stops into the green fields, into a big city development area before the first house was built. You have to imagine that. So you built the subway and the infrastructure first, and then the city of Vienna started developing what is called this Flugfeld Aspern or Aspern Seestadt, which you can see here has been developed or been developing in the last 10 years, and it will grow to a place for 20,000 people to live in. This is another recent development in Vienna. It's linked to a new station in the center of Vienna, the central station, in fact. And in this development, half, more or less, it's slightly changing at this moment, but half of the housing units have been dedicated to be subsidized housing, meaning social housing. And Vienna, for instance, also features such projects as Alt-Erla. It has been, I think, published worldwide, and especially the swimming pools on the roofs have become iconic as the fact that basically you could have social housing with swimming pools on the roof. And Alt-Erla is one project by an architect called Harry Glück. Glück in German actually means happiness. So he himself claimed this project to give the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, which of course you know very well as a saying. So I'm giving you an overview of Vienna's situation, and I'm going to show you now some more numbers and facts. About 60% of the Viennese are renters. They live, I have to say it differently. You can see here in the bottom, about 75% of the whole population of Vienna is renting a housing unit. And of these renters, 60% actually live in municipal or subsidized cooperative housing. You can see the numbers here. Basically, we have 220,000 council housing units and 200,000 subsidized apartments in Vienna currently, and that number is yearly growing. If we ask ourselves who has access to these municipal housing apartments and also to the large part of cooperative housing, you have to acquire a so-called Vienna housing ticket, a Wiener Wohnticket, which gives some rules and regulations. It's a minimum age, certain citizenship regulations. That's something that has been debated a lot, and I'm also critical of in times of migration, in times of a mobile transnational world. But also it asks for 2 years principal place of residency at an actual address in Vienna. That has become a real problem because people who actually move to Vienna and do not get into permanent rental contracts hardly ever get to this position to finally be eligible for this Wiener Wohnticket, for this Viennese housing tickets. What is interesting for you for sure is that there's a maximum yearly income of for one person of 45,000 euros. That is very high. As if you look at this, 45,000 euros per year maximum income of a person relates to 12,800 at which point you're actually at the risk of poverty. So with comparing these numbers, I think what becomes obvious is that Vienna's housing system and these admission rules actually feature a middle class, or basically the population really up to a higher middle class. So what that does give is actually an enormous diversity of dwellers in the blocks. So you have actually what has been critiqued lately is that it actually lacks the really poor people, yeah? Because there's not enough number at this moment, and the number of poor people is growing in Vienna as well as everywhere in the world. So it cannot actually give enough housing to everybody who is actually desperate for looking for one. But the history of it actually managed to have a diversity of people in these housings. And one famous example, for instance, is a politician, Peter Bild, who has been living in a municipal housing all his life. And he's again and again being critiqued by popular media that he's not leaving his social housing. However, he's one example, and he himself, kind of a leftist politician, declares that he is one of the proofs that social housing should really be for everyone. Also, and I think that is also super critical, if this is the map of Vienna, then the Gemeindebauten, these communal housing units, are spread all over the city. Of course, with some difference. In the very city center, you have less, and then there's some areas on the outskirts where the number is growing. But generally, you have a spatial distribution quite evenly, and that also relates to the fact that in Vienna, you cannot tell how much someone earns by looking at their home address. Not yet, yeah? I mean, it's also a condition checking the system, but that is a very beautiful fact, actually, that we like very much. And as I already said, in Vienna, 75% of the population rents their home. And that has a historic starting point. The very historic goal of Red Vienna, which we will come to in a minute, had been to say, okay, there should be no disadvantage to owners of a housing unit. So if you rent a home of a municipality house or a cooperative, you are supposed to have security of contract. That means there is no limitation, time limitation of contract, stability of rental costs, and even the right to pass on your apartment to your kids or to your partner. So if you consider these issues, then we could actually claim that municipal cooperative renting model is a great retirement strategy. And that, of course, sounds super counterintuitive to the idea that worldwide people think a pension plan is to actually buy a home, to buy a house. However, as a collective idea, or basically as a society retirement, as a society pension plan, to have a large number of collectivized housing units and actually on a renting model is a great retirement strategy for a larger number of people. And if you ask more specifically why, then I'm sorry that this is in German, but if you look at this, once you build a building, you have 100% costs. But by 30 years, these costs actually, the payment of debt goes down until after about 30 years, any building is paid off. And that is the moment when in Vienna, in municipal housing, but also in cooperative housing, rent drops. it drops to a number, or to like, in this case, to half the price, that actually just features maintenance costs and also some um, solidarity rent that goes back into building new cooperative housing. So after the building has been paid off, the people pay half the price, half the rent, and in half of this rent, you still have a solidarity amount that is being collected to be reinvested in new collectivized housing. Also, when it comes to the number of subsidies, I actually put them down for you. So housing subsidies in millions of euros would be like that. So about 330 million euros are spent on new construction of subsidized housing. 250 million euros are spent on renovation of housing subsidies, and 70 million euros are spent on subject subsidies. So if you look at this, I want to make a point for object subsidies, which is basically the largest portion of the 650 million. You have basically 580 million euros being spent in objects, meaning that the subsidies go into building of houses rather than giving money to poor people. And that is something that Vienna believes very strongly in, because it basically, other than giving money to poor people for them to spend it on private investors, expensive housing units, Vienna invests in the infrastructure of housing units themselves, and basically on building a larger and larger stock of collectivized. So just to give you an overview, and you all have to come to Vienna to look at all these different houses. For instance, this is the very famous Karl Marx Hof from Red Vienna, or you can see several, like all different shapes and colors and balconies, and that has even been critiqued, that the kind of aesthetics of housing has been maybe even too overwhelming, that it's a very facade concept. Also the units, the buildings themselves are not too big. So mostly social housing is built in the numbers of 70, 100, 150 housing units. Only now that it's only very current developments to build larger units, larger housing blocks. But Vienna's population is growing, currently by about 20,000 to 40,000 inhabitants per year. And the problem is it is not growing by the respective number of subsidized housing units per year. Even though, as like, for instance, in 2017, we had a record of 24,000 units planned, only 3,300 units of these were subsidized. So you can see how the relationship of private units being planned and subsidized is at this moment extremely to the advantage of privatized. That has never been like this, and this is actually really shaking the system. Since the private housing market is booming, we get all the problems the private market brings with it. Yeah? There's no rent control, it comes with short-term contracts, or it comes with selling the units. It sells the units as investment products. We have whole houses being built only to be used as Airbnb from the beginning. And as a second effect, actually, urban land prices are skyrocketing. So what that does to the system is there's a lack of affordable land for subsidized housing. It should say subsidized housing here. In order to build and finance subsidized housing, land can only cost a certain price. Since these land prices are getting very high at the moment, in fact, it happened that not all housing subsidies could be used because of a lack of land. So you can see that even worldwide celebrated Vienna is kind of in the state of some sort of crisis. So to wrap it up, while the average rental price in Vienna is still low, yeah, and it includes all these very low rental prices that I just mentioned, that are even at €3.50. And with rent control for all buildings being built prior to 1945. And this rent control actually says that it cannot cost more than €5.58, yeah, plus some increases and so on. We have in the private market, yeah, for new private rent prices, already an enormous increase. And then if you go to very special locations and so on, the difference is, as you can see yourself, enormous. So since the city of Vienna has a long social democratic history, it reacted to this situation actually by reactivating building housing itself. Actually, the city of Vienna stopped in 2004 to construct housing, construct this typical Gemeindebau housing themselves. After 2004, only subsidized cooperative housing was built. So basically to react to the current situation and also to a lot of critique and citizen protests, bottom-up radical democratic movements and so on, asking to reactivate it again. That actually that happened. Plus, Vienna introduced the building code novella in 2018 with many issues, but two of them being, for instance, really to give a price limit to certain urban lands related to zoning, plus to prohibit Airbnb misuse of housing areas. So the reactivation of the Gemeindebau, of the kind of classic municipal housing blocks, in more detail says that 4,000 municipality housing units are planned to get going until 2020. And that as an addition to subsidized cooperative housing. Yeah? It should not be instead of. And then it has certain, and these municipality housing units come along with the kind of stable conditions that is so important to Vienna, which is for the same price as we talked about, permanent contracts, no equity finance needed for those who need this housing. Plus, the city of Vienna organized the building code amendment, and that is highly debated. So some people even call it quasi-expropriation, and I want to explain it briefly to you. It says that when there is a rezoning or rededication of land, let's say of agricultural land, and here you see the subway that I just mentioned, yeah? The subway running across agricultural land to actually get to this new urban development area. And for instance, these lands have been not built and actually not ready they're being saved for speculation. In order to get this land onto being possible to be built on, the city now declared that it will introduce a new zoning category, which would be called subsidized housing. And if they rezone agricultural land and dedicate it to housing, it will now, by definition, become subsidized housing, meaning that 75% of this new building land and the possible housing square footage is dedicated to subsidized housing. And this 75% actually comes with a limited price for the land at a certain number. Maybe this number says not so much to you, but believe me, this is up to or down to actually 20% current land prices. So it's a real big impact and what you would call a kind of impact into the private market, but on the conditions of that housing is a public goal. And what is also important, actually at this moment, of course, this agricultural land is worth much less. So there's still a gain. However, there's not the speculation that the farmers or the owners of the land are waiting for. In fact, this building code amendment is also meant for international speculators, because also in Vienna, this it started that people are actually what we would call land grabbing started. basically to buy land and speculate on it, since knowing that Vienna is growing. So that actually gives a serious, how should we say that? It declares that you can speculate with Viennese land that easily. And if you still bear with me, I will now give you a short overview of the history, how it came to this social housing program. In fact, it all started with Red Vienna. Red Vienna was a social democratic city administration between the two world wars, 1918 and 1934. In this time, 64,000 municipality units were built. And Red Vienna city administration had a clear goal of redistribution of wealth to the poor, to create social housing, to invest in city infrastructure, and I could name many more points here. And what you see here is, as I already showed you briefly, the very famous Karl Marx Hof, and it's still called Karl Marx Hof, and it is, for instance, positioned in quite a bourgeois district in Vienna, and still very successful. I think it's the most visited housing project in Vienna by many, many tourists. Red Vienna already started a distribution concept or a spatialization concept and distributed these housing Gemeindebauten, municipal housing projects all around the city. Some historians claim that it was very consciously placed, like workers' housing placed in bourgeois areas, in the city center, in places that you would usually not imagine for the poorer people. And that has been a very important starting point for the development until today. So we actually do have these workers' housing units and housing blocks in every district of Vienna. But more so, they not only built housing, but built libraries, public baths, public infrastructure, already built laundries and swimming pools in the housing blocks, spread, as you can see here, public libraries all across the city. It was the idea of giving infrastructure, providing infrastructure to everybody. And if you would tour Vienna now, in all these housing blocks, and it's like about 400 of this time, you will find this reading. Yeah? And I will translate this to you in large scale red letters on every single housing block. It says, this building has been built by the city of Vienna in the years so and so by means of a housing construction tax. And imagine any government today that would proudly put in red letters a tax onto a building, saying this has been built because we taxed the rich and actually redistributed it to those who needed housing. And it was a very progressive tax, explicitly meant for redistribution. And it came along with, of course, something we wouldn't today consider appropriate anymore. It came along with advertising. For instance, this is the advertising or the kind of promotion of a luxury tax. Luxury goods were being taxed in order to actually allocate means for this housing program. And the housing program, you can see here how it was the pride of this government to actually build more and more social housing. And as I already mentioned, housing already then, even though it could always be better, was meant to be more than housing. Yeah? With housing, you need a mixture of functions. You need a good housing surrounding neighborhoods, public spaces, children's playgrounds, laundries, workspaces, libraries, etc. Next to this kind of municipality, what you could call top-down approach, and it has been, of course, also critiqued for its top-down approach, there was also a popular agency approach at this time, which was because in the 1920s, there was such a housing need, people actually started to build houses themselves at the edge of the city. It's the kind of historically called Viennese settlement movement. And this settlement movement has become of great interest today again, because it actually portrays a second history or line of history to Red Vienna, which actually shows a self-initiative housing, bottom-up, maybe more democratic, even radical democratic approach to organizing your housing yourself. So in relationship to this top-down approach, which was critiqued and has been and is critiqued until today for, of course, this paternalistic mode of giving. So this would be the second strain of like doing it yourself. Adolf Loos, a very famous Austrian architect, maybe he's known to some of you, also developed during this time a so-called house with one wall, basically row houses that started to become the starting point of multiple units being stacked and actually declaring how putting together like row housing, but then stacking actually is also a model of sharing infrastructure, sharing buildings costs. And this bottom-up today, this bottom-up strategies relate or translate today into self-initiated or self-governed housing concepts, into housing co-ops that are really not from the state, not from the city, but actually being by individual groups organizing themselves. They invent new models of co-living. They've become very important to prevent, to actually provide good neighborhood amenities. A very famous example of that had been Sargfabrik that was built in 1996, and is a building that has been organized, self-organized, bottom up. It's a cooperative. Nobody owns anything there. It's an association that collectively owns the building, but then rents out to its users, and also went along with the kind of Viennese tradition that you could have affordable housing with, in this case, bath and sauna and so on. Another quite successful project, Wohnprojekt Wien, built in 2013, also it's a so-called Baugruppenprojekt. All of these projects are subsidized housing, yeah? So they're subsidized, and because your special housing concepts are getting subsidies, they have to give something back to the neighborhood. So they actually, there's competitions for the subsidized self-initiated projects. And in order to win, kind of prize is that you get the cheap land from the city and that you get the subsidies. You actually have to propose what you give to the neighborhood, meaning that you actually design and develop communal meeting spaces, communal children places, shops, etc. Anything that is very difficult in private speculators housing to actually be developed along with profitable housing units. One project that I was myself as an architect involved in is the house that we called the intersectional city house. It's self-initiated, in this case not subsidized, partly self-built. The group of LGBT migrants, handicapped people, and so on actually developed the concept of a one kitchen house in an existing three-story apartment house themselves, and we realized it as architects, and they themselves are living a solidary economic system of supporting each other. Everybody pays whatever she can, and also that is a rental system. And another concept I'm also involved in as an architect with my architectural studio is one that goes along with this general concept of use instead of ownership, which of course applies to municipality housing, to co-op housing, but also to non-governmental initiatives such as this one. A group of self-initiated bottom-up developers are actually establishing a so-called syndicate called Habitat in Austria. It's quite similar to the Mietshäuser syndicate in Germany, and that is a cooperation, a solidarity association of different groups, larger and smaller, of people who actually buy from the private market houses, existing houses or pieces of ground, in order to collectivize it, to recollectivize it, to take it off the private speculation market and to get it into a solidary collectivized structure. And in this case, I'm working with a group on a neighborhood center that includes housing, working, open ateliers, sports interests, and so on. And the project is called, beautifully, Floor, schöner Leben ohne Rendite, or Better Living Without Stockholders' Profit. And I'm nearly at my end. I want to make a claim of, if we understand housing as a human right, which we do here, then housing is not a commodity, but it is a public good, and we could say a public goal. And if that is the case, then basically the public has to intervene in the private markets, because the private market has different agendas, has different interests. And within this line, I was recently for a text working on some sort of care manifesto, and I wanted to bring that at the very end to you. I would say that we should cease to sell public ground, cease speculation. We should claim public property as really public. The A stands for acquiring urban land as commons, acquiring urban land from the private market, actively turning public housing into a democratic task. That would actually apply to Vienna more than, I don't know, about the Honolulu situation, but to really open it up and not to have it so top-down paternalistically, to raise the number of communal and housing units, and to rent to everyone. So basically to also rethink the modes of access, admission regulations. And finally, to explain why housing is a public interest, I guess that is what I did do now, or try to do now, and to express solidarity with homeless and other vulnerable groups by, I would say, following these points and many more of my care manifesto. And that is actually the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
In this country, consumer spending, great, accounts for 2/3 to 3/4 of our economy. So that now in the US in general, according to the 2010 census, 50% of the people in our country are now low income or to poverty, 50%. And I was just wondering, in your country, once you went to this model, Vienna model of subsidized, socialized housing, could you give us any idea of what effect that had on your economy? Could you understand that?
Yes.
Great.
I can see that. Okay, I can start with the historic impact. Actually, you have to imagine the start of Red Vienna was very strict rent control regulations. These rent control regulations actually made the construction of housing for people, for the private markets, not interesting anymore. So the city actually took this task and built it themselves, and that had an impact on the how do we call this now? On the question that you just raised. I'm missing the English word. On the economic system, because it actually raised a lot of jobs and economic turnover. Now today, the issue is more complicated, because the question is, if we just think the economic conditions or the economic outcome of the construction of housing, if it comes to the question if the housing market is actually an economic factor, then certainly it is. And it is whether it's public or whether it's private, if that was the question.
Yes, I have a question for you. Thank you for your presentation. That was very interesting. Do you have to be a citizen of Austria to live in subsidized housing?
If I have to be an Austrian citizen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in fact, no. And luckily, the European community actually, there was such a regulation at one point, and the European community actually said, "Hey, listen, every European should be eligible to municipal housing." But what actually citizen groups and critics are claiming is that we would like to open to everyone. And of course, we know that it's a big issue because there's not enough units. So the answer could only be to build even more units and to get rid of the restriction that you can only enter if you're a European citizen.
Okay, then I have a follow-up question. How do you avoid speculation?
On housing or on
Yes,
urban
on
land?
housing.
Or both?
On housing.
On housing, okay. In this building code amendment, the city of Vienna now has a regulation that you can, for instance, not rent out housing more than half of the year to Airbnb. That would be one maybe prevention of speculation, but you cannot, and this is a big issue, the question to prevent speculation on housing units can only be to not allow the housing unit prices to explode on the market. So the city of Vienna has been very good throughout the last 100 or 80 years to actually have a lower level of housing prices because it controls 60% of it and has rent control on it. So that actually gets the other prices not get so high. But as I showed you, that has also become difficult today. So in fact, leftist parties are rightly claiming for rent control. You have to basically look at modes to prevent the idea that with housing or with the need of housing of others, you make money.
Okay. Thank you.
I was curious if Vienna participates in a digital currency program, and if so, how would you, hold on just a second. How would you integrate that into public infrastructure as cities become smarter?
Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly what you mean with the digital currency. If it's a kind of international money, or we certainly don't work with bitcoins, if that is the question. I don't know. No, the city of Vienna does not to my knowledge, work with Bitcoin.
Thank you.
Not the municipality and not the corporations.
The complexity of the problems we're facing, I want to take the easy way out and outsource to you the solution. I appreciate that you're placing the housing crisis within the context of the market economy and the incentives that has created that distort a lot of things. Frankly, middle-class people in the United States invest in real estate as a means to acquire savings. And that is central to sort of the American dream and has been. And we're trapped in that sort of tax structure and the incentives that has created. I'm reminded of Barack Obama's statement that if he had it to do all over, to start from scratch, he would have adopted a single-payer system for the healthcare system in the United States. But given the powerful vested interests and the legacy we have, he instead came up with this technical term is half-ass system, Obamacare, rather than single-payer. Now, I think the crisis we're facing in housing is of a similar nature, that really we have to move towards a model along the lines of what you are suggesting, rather than continue with this half-ass system we have now, which is basically based upon viewing housing as a commodity and as an investment necessity for middle-class people. How do we make the transition? That's on your shoulders.
I think for that you have to invite me and we would have to work on that a bit longer.
Okay.
No. Good night and now have a great day over there. And please hope